Hi, welcome to our workshop, Overcome Your Experience Bias and See Diversity Grow. We hope you have an informative and hopefully entertaining next 30 minutes. First, I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Roy Dockery, VP of Customer Care with Swisslog.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roy Dockery, as Michael stated. As the Vice President for Customer Care for Swisslog, I'm responsible for all essentially post-sales customer-facing activities. So field service, technical support, software support, and all scheduling and dispatching. Swisslog Healthcare is an organization. We provide automation solutions to large healthcare organizations, everything from material transport to pharmacy automation, inventory management, and just overall kind of logistics around material transport in hospitals, whether it's medication, blood product, or even at times administrative paperwork. So that's what we do within the healthcare industry.
Thanks, Roy. And I'm Michael Simpson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Perrin. Perrin uses behavioral science to personalize career pathways, professional development and coaching, and hiring for employers. My background is in software industry and running the human aspects of mergers and acquisitions for the fifth largest software company in the world, as well as living in Russia for about 7 years and coaching young business people, especially folks with troubled pasts, often adult children of alcoholics, to be successful business folks. After that time, I founded Perrin to use science that we got in touch with over there to help companies like Swisslog and others better hire and develop their staff. So Roy, when we came together, you were faced with a very interesting set of problems. Could you give us a little bit of background on that?
Yes, absolutely. So back in 2013, I assumed the responsibility for our pharmacy automation division. And what we were experiencing at the time was a high, essentially termination rate of our employees. And it was largely driven by behavioral issues, whether it was customer satisfaction, time management, maturity. It's a very highly technical job because this was specifically in our pharmacy automation division. So it was robotics and automation equipment. But what we found is that we continued to have customers that had issues with their employees, and we continued to have performance problems, not due to the technicians' technical capability or even the functionality of the equipment. It was more the way they interacted with people and how they communicated that led to us having to terminate employees. And with there being such complicated technology, there's a long training time, there's a long lead time as far as acquiring new talent. And then there's also a lot of downtime penalties associated with our service level agreements. So any gaps in employment and especially coverage for most of our sites makes us lose a lot of money. So we approached Perrin to see if they could help us and to see if Michael and his team could help us identify the behaviors that we needed to hire to successfully build our support organization. So that's what we were facing, but we just came across the fact that our problems seemed to be behavior, not technical. We could train people to be technically proficient, but if we didn't hire the right behavior, they didn't last.
Thanks, Roy. You know, it's also was interesting to us at the time is that you were firing about 8% of your field service staff every year for behavioral issues, right?
Correct. Yeah. Well, yeah, between 8 to 12% between 2014, around 2014.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit about the diversity of your staff or lack thereof before you started this process.
So before we started the process, especially around our broader support organization, so we started the process with a smaller group, but largely our support organization was white male, and the large majority of it was white males that were either baby boomers or Generation X. We had some segments, small pockets of diversity. Maybe we had like 2 minorities in New York City and maybe 1 or 2 in California, but the majority of the country, from a geographic perspective, was largely white male in our field service organization. And so that was, and that was just the kind of the tradition, the industry within itself. The industry had largely been fed by unions and ex-military. So it just kind of, attracting like for like, and that's kind of how the organization had been for years, probably, 30 or 40 years prior to me taking over the support organization.
Yeah, I find that that's not just true of your company, but of a lot of organizations in field service. They're traditionally known as pale, stale, and male, older white men. Now, what was interesting is that after we're going to talk about the process that you went through, and a process that anyone can apply with different types of tools. But one thing that was interesting is this question of diversity. I have applied within my own company and with a lot of other organizations different types of perspectives on diversity, where most organizations are thinking about diversity almost exclusively related to protected classes as defined by the U.S. Department of Labor. But it's very eye-opening to look at the origin of the word diverse. It comes from the root word of divertir, which is to divert. And if you think about that word, it is essentially to move from where you are to someone else, to turn aside from your current path or course. So the way that we think about diversity, in the way that I would encourage all of your organizations to think about it, is not to create diversity within your organization for the sake of different kinds of people based on their outer structure or just ethnicity or associations or gender, but to strive for diversity, to create diversity of thought. The difference, though, is that if you can have diversity of thought, but predictability in behavior, you kind of have the best of both worlds. What we set about to do together was to create an environment where you could hire people purely based on their abilities and allow for diversity of thought, which naturally creates a diversity of ethnicity and age and gender. And so when we were looking at Roy's workforce, we found that there was something pretty consistent across his industry that he was also struggling with. And you had mentioned that before, Roy, about the middle-aged white men. But what was also the problem of being able to change that? How are you trying to change that unsuccessfully?
Yeah, absolutely. So and like you said, and it's not just specific to healthcare or any industry, in service across the board, like it's saying there in the presentation, when you survey field service executives, they keep speaking of what they call a talent gap, right? So there's a lack of people who have historical experience working in specific service industries, whether it's healthcare, industrial equipment, construction equipment, the food service industry, whatever it may be. And so while people have an aging workforce, because people have been settled into these careers for decades, as they're going out and they're trying to recruit talent to fill these positions, they're discovering the fact that what they're perceiving as a talent gap. And so one thing that, as when I speak in different events around the industry, that I've been challenging is that it's not necessarily an experience gap that we have, right? And you just talked about diversity from a thought perspective, right? I think now we have a diversity of learning experience and a diversity of how people have gained experience, right? So we don't have the traditional, I worked this job for 10 years, but you have people who have been self-taught. So one of the things that I think we're struggling with as an employer, because we're biased towards recruiting and hiring based on experience, is the fact that we don't have a talent gap, we have an experience problem. So there are talented people out there who have, predictable behavior, that have hard skills that'll allow them to be competent in our roles. But since we're still trying to recruit for experience, we're not really giving talent a chance, right? So what everyone's discussing and kind of putting out in the industry as a problem is really an opportunity, but we have to look at the way that we recruit differently and the way that we look at candidates differently.
Well, that's a pretty controversial statement to say that we don't have a talent gap, we have an experience gap. I would say also that we have an openness gap from the employer side. So we have an experience gap from the applicant side, and we have an openness gap to be able to accept people like that and adjust for them, who might have the abilities but not necessarily the experience. So there's a gap on both sides for sure. So when we're dealing with multiple generations, we've got a lot of diversity that's kind of happening, if you will, to us, rather than us selecting it and addressing it more, intentionally. Roy, what would you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think there's, and like you can see from this slide, and we'll jump into it a little bit more on the next. From this slide, I think the one thing that we need to discuss is the dreaded millennial, right? Because and when I look on LinkedIn, when you look at, there's always news articles or something being published about, millennials and their spending habits and their work ethic and their employer loyalty. And I'm a millennial, right? And if you look at these charts here, I'm 36 years old, so I'm at the very top end of Generation Y, which is where some people say millennials begin, but Generation Y and Generation Z are not the same. So even when we're talking about experiences and what to expect from people, I think one thing we need to stop doing is classifying all millennials in the same generation, right? Because what shapes the generation, if we can go to the next slide, Michael, um, what shapes a generation, right, are the historical events that they've participated in, technological developments that they've seen, social change and just social dynamics, popular culture, economics, right? Those are the things that kind of shape generations. And people in their 30s have experienced things differently when it comes to technology, popular culture, and history than people who were, say, in their early 20s. Right. So there's a difference in the way we were educated. There's a difference in the way that we've engaged and been introduced to technology. And there was a difference in how we transitioned from analog and traditional learning methods to the more digital, touchscreen, technological kind of IoT world that we currently live in. So when you look at the workforce, not only are we battling an experience difference when it actually comes to employment, but we're also battling, and like you can see here from this graphic, just the different mindsets, right? And in ways that people think across 5 generations that could potentially be in the same building, right? From traditionalists to what they're calling Generation Alpha or the Generation Z, or on this slide that they're referring to as a Generation 2020. So I think it's important that we also have to take into account and kind of educate ourselves, as you said before, the openness that we have to express to know that we can hire people who have competency, who have the behavior, but when it comes to the way that we look at the world, the way that individuals look at the world, it's going to be shaped by the generation that we're a part of and the experiences that we've seen in our lives. And so that needs to play into the recruitment process. It needs to play into the mentality of the hiring managers, right? As we kind of look to transition into a new style and a new form of recruitment.
You can also try to bring them along and help them understand things the way that we understand it. We had a running list on one of our whiteboards for many, many months of movies that every millennial needs to watch so that they'll understand all of my movie quotes in the office. And it didn't take, but they did like some of them. So as we move into this new age of recruitment, we want to talk a little bit about kind of what works, what doesn't work, some things you may have tried, some things you haven't. One of the things that really doesn't work is driving forward to really just steal employees from other companies. This is the homepage for a consortium of the 5 largest tech companies, software companies in Denver, Colorado. Each one of those organizations ponied up $50,000 so $250,000 to build this website and to create a program specifically to recruit and essentially poach employees from Silicon Valley companies. So they want to pitch Colorado, you can own a bigger house, etc. After almost 2 years, they think that they can trace that maybe one person was hired. $250,000 in a poaching strategy to try to get tech software developers primarily to move to Denver, Colorado. This type of poaching strategy is not a way to go about filling your talent pipeline. And it really starts with, how do you begin in your recruitment process? So we think that those organizations didn't necessarily address the right audience, but they also didn't present themselves well. Roy, what do you say about the job description and your job ads and what you've learned from that?
Absolutely. So one thing is, in the traditional recruitment, you have people out there who are on Indeed or Monster.com or Career Builder, right? They're searching for jobs, and they're trying to take whatever experience or skills they have and relate them to a job, right? So that's the way that the job searchers are looking. And then from an employer perspective, you typically see recruitment posts like the one that's posted here. And this isn't from my organization. It was just one I pulled off of Indeed.com to use as an example, but it was for a field service engineer position, which is something that we typically recruit for, right? So the first thing you'll notice here is that from an experience perspective, they're asking for 3 to 5 years of experience in field service, right? So this is an entry level field service engineering position at a very niche organization that deals in the oil and gas industry. So when you look at this job posting, one, it needs 3 to 5 years experience. It's asking for an associate's degree or equivalent military training, which is very broad. They want people specifically that have a background in oil and gas and chemical microprocessing. And if you look at the fourth line, it's saying that people must be capable of training junior FSEs. So it's actually recruiting and saying when you start, you need to be able to train junior employees on very specific technology. So what we found was, when you look at posts like this, when this is what's presented in front of a candidate and the candidate's looking and saying, okay, do I meet these requirements? You're going to significantly shrink your pool, right? Because for someone to meet these requirements, they either have to be from your competitor who makes similar equipment, or they're one of your former employees. So I like to call this this recruitment post a Dear John letter, right? Like you're reaching out and you're trying to connect with somebody who already worked at your place of employment, and you're trying to pull them in. So that's one of the issues with it. So when you want to shift to a more skills-based recruitment, when you want to shift to something that's more behaviorally based, then you have to change the way that you're recruiting talent. Because even if within your organization, your hiring managers want to change, your human resources department wants to change, if you don't change the way you're advertising the position, you're not going to like cast a wider net of the potential candidates you're going to pull in that'll drive diversity and that'll get people with different types of talent and skill into your organization.
There are some great resources at skillful.com. That's skillful.com. That can also help you with this. We're a Skillful partner, and Swisslog has partnered with Skillful as well. It's a nonprofit focused on really reskilling adults, but they have great resources for organizations that are looking to switch to competency-based hiring. So as we change our job descriptions, we also have to address what are we going to do from the requirements for resumes as well. One of the stats that is out there is that and this is a study by Accenture for SHRM, that as employers use college degree as a proxy for hard and soft skills, it really limits your viable candidates. That right now there's currently a 19% gap in the United States in the middle skills jobs for people that are specifically qualified based on the posted criteria. And I'll give you an example of why this criteria is really not indicative of actually what you need, because it really isn't what you have. For network administrators, over 60%, I think it's 63% of the job postings require a 4-year degree, but only 27% of network administrators have a 4-year degree. So what employers are asking for when they go to their HR professional says, hey, what do you want? They say, I want someone like this, but it isn't even what they have. So you could say it isn't really what they need. So if we want to switch to competency-based hiring, we have to start with competency-based recruitment. Roy, do you want to walk through this?
Absolutely. And as you stated, Michael, these were some of the steps, a few of them, just because it didn't get into much detail that Skillful assisted us with as far as trying to guide us through how to revise our job descriptions and then in turn our job postings. But one of the things that they asked us to do is exactly what you just said, right? Look at your job posting and look at what requirements you have. So one thing that we found is that we had education requirements for an associate's degree required, and preferred was a bachelor's degree when almost none of our employees, so I can't even mention that probably less than 5% of our employees had an associate or a bachelor's degree. 95% of our employees did not, right? So it was just looking at the reality between what are we presenting as a requirement versus what we currently have that's working. And the other thing is that reducing the experience needed for entry level positions, especially when we were hiring from the military, because right now I believe 87% of my employees roughly are ex-military. Right, none of my military candidates that I was hiring had previous experience in field service. So we also determined that for an entry level position, that wasn't a requirement. And then the way that we positioned it, we tried to position it around competencies and skills versus specific experience. So instead of asking for people who have specifics in automation robotics or experience in pneumatic tube systems, we started asking for basic, do you have computer networking experience? Do you have electromechanical troubleshooting experience? Can you use hand tools? Can you do basic electrical troubleshooting? And when we changed that, it actually expanded the pool of people who were confident enough to apply, right? Because that's what it is. It's like the people who are looking have to think that if they're going to apply, they have a chance. So adjusting some of those requirements in the recruitment process allows you to kind of broaden that net that you're casting out to pull in a larger pool of candidates.
One thing about that, we've even internally have tried to hone our job descriptions as much as possible. And as a small company, we've had the benefit of always being able to hire competency based. So we've never had education requirements for any job that specifically didn't require like an IO psychology degree. We have 3 doctorates on our staff, but for any of our other positions, we don't require it. And so we did the obligatory X amount of education or equivalent experience. And one day I started to think, do people really believe that? Or do they even read it? And so I took out education altogether. There was no change whatsoever in the amount of applicants that we got. So I added the education section back into our job descriptions, and I said, no education required. Seriously, we mean this. We care about your abilities and to do the job, not just what is your history and what is on your resume or something to that effect. In the next 36 hours, we had 3 times the number of applicants for that type of position that we had ever had. So don't assume just because you leave something out of your job description that the people reading that job description aren't assuming that your position is going to be just like everybody else's. It's a little like the trained flea that continues to limit its jump even though the lid has been removed. You might have to go the extra mile to tell people that you're very serious about it. So a lot of other companies are kind of joining the party. Some big organizations like Google and Apple are starting to eliminate college degrees. But once you eliminate this other vetting criteria, how do you then determine what you need to vet, what you need to be able to vet candidates without a traditional resume? Roy?
Absolutely. And so once it's and especially when you have your hiring managers, right? So typically, especially from a service perspective, and I know in a lot of other roles, the pre-screening is kind of done by human resources to eliminate, application problems or criminal backgrounds or anything that you have as a requirement for employment, salary, availability, travel requirements. When you get to the technical interview, I found that the hiring managers who are technical don't normally have an issue trying to identify or eliminate people who are either good or bad technically, right? So they can normally pick out somebody that doesn't know what they're talking about or doesn't really know software or doesn't understand the product that you need for them to support. So what we wanted to really enhance in that process once we started getting the right candidates in is, okay, what do we do to get engage them in an interview to get them to really open up, be honest, and be clear in what it is that we're going to ask them to do. So when we partnered with Parent, our original aspiration was to develop or to get insight on proper behavioral questions that we can ask during the interview that what I've learned and what I've come to coin it as, that break the interview facade, right? So the traditional answers that people have memorized on their greatest strengths and their greatest weaknesses, and and how I work hard. And so but to get genuine to just get genuine answers about what it is that they care about, what they're passionate about, and how they would react in situations of stress. So using the behavioral assessment to kind of evaluate, one, how they would fit our organizational culture and would they be ready to integrate into our organization, and then looking at the attributes where they either meet our standard or where they deviate from our standard, and using those as behavioral questions during the interview process allowed us to have much more meaningful, engaging, and what I would consider real interviews with candidates. And so it's just, and the one thing that was always interesting to me is when you go through the interview and people are always very buttoned up. They try to, they sit up straight. They try to look you directly in the eyes. Um, and kind of just follow normal interview etiquette. And what I found is when we would answer these questions during the interview, it would even change people's body language. People would sit forward, they would get more comfortable because they felt like they were about to answer a question and something that they were really comfortable in. So you could even tell they kind of settled more into their skin and gave very honest, like I said, passionate answers. And that allowed us to see the candidate more fully. So yes, the people are capable of doing these competencies and they have the skills to be able to be trained in what we need them to do. But the assessment was critical in making sure that they had the kind of behavior that would allow them to be successful in our organization and a good representative of our company in front of our customers.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. Once you get them through the interview and you bring them into your organization, if you have proprietary equipment and you're now providing that training for them, what is the training methodology you found is successful?
Yes, especially when you're looking at just a diversity of learning styles, right? The one thing that's become popular currently is what people are calling micro learning. So if you go to the next slide there, micro learning is essentially what everyone's doing nowadays on YouTube, right? So it's kind of microscopic learning. It's bursts of information, 2 to 5 minutes in length. And then there's some key tips that that some online resources have, where especially when you're trying to train millennials, so kind of the and when I'm just saying millennials because it's one of the largest populations of people that you can be recruiting and bringing into your organizations right now. The way that you structure that training material, right, you want it to be brief and you want it to be like engaging and attractive, right? It needs to be accessible, so everything can't be behind your firewall or in a printed manual that people can only look at behind a closed door, right? People need instant access to it. And the one thing that helps with the cross collaboration across generations is that you make your training material and your training process collaborative. So if you have people who like digital training, you give them access to digital information, you give them access to videos, but then you put them in the field with someone who's more analog, who understands the manuals, and then they get that hands-on experience with someone from a different generation who may not engage with them via Slack or Google Plus or Chatter or any of these digital outlets. So having training material that's dynamic and flexible enough that it can be agile and accessible in the field, and that it's relevant to what you're currently doing, right? There's nothing worse than looking at that HR video from like the 1980s. Like you got to make sure your content is relevant to your current equipment, your current technology, and your current workforce. So when you're trying to train this like blended generation, right, you've got to allow them to collaborate, and you have to give them tools to be able to be trained hands-on using like analog traditional methods like manuals and PDFs that they can download, but then also giving them videos and e-learning content so that you get the most out of you get the most out of your employee base, and it encourages collaboration between the different generations that you have at work, because they will learn differently and they'll also train differently. But if you equip everybody to be able to engage with the information in the way that they prefer, it allows everybody to more effectively work together.
Yeah, I find with a lot of our customers that the online curriculum for Gen Xers or Boomers isn't really as popular as with millennials, because they are much more comfortable with learning at their own pace and jumping back and forth, but sitting in a classroom is also generationally completely different. The Gen Xers and the Boomers, especially the Boomers, are much more inclined to want to go to a course and learn, and the millennials not so much. Another piece of this is the company culture. Here's an example of a major corporation. A friend of mine tweeted this to me while we were working on our values inside of our company. And this was the CEO traveling all over the world to launch the values. And these values were created by the CEO. And the lots of excitement in the Amsterdam office shows you exactly how much buy-in these values had from the employees. This is not really necessarily the culture that organizations want, regardless of generation. It doesn't look like anybody's very happy with this. What we found is that to get loyalty, especially with younger generations, to the point where, figuratively, not literally, they would stop a bullet for you, stop the bullet of, there's a troubled customer, there is a big proposal that needs to go out, there is a high manufacturing or high production schedule that really requires people to buckle down and really come together. These bullets are being thrown at companies all the time. And who's going to step up to do that without being coerced? These are the folks that have buy-in into the organization. And of course, that's not news for anybody. That's not anything where we're going to teach you that you haven't already thought about. But there was an interesting process that we went through, and I've heard some other organizations have gone through something similar to this, is in the creation of values. If you're a smaller organization, involving families in the creation of your values and the behaviors. We actually had boyfriends, girlfriends, partners, husbands, wives involved in our values exercise. And not just our employees. Our executives physically weren't in the room when our initial values were put down, and we worked with our team to hone them over time, which was a very interesting way to go about doing it. What ended up happening is that those values, instead of being on a poster or stuck on T-shirts or something to that effect, they are something that everybody in the company and even their families understand and value. So that's one way to earn loyalty of the millennials. What are some other ways, Roy, that you found helped you earn their loyalty?
Absolutely. And this is just kind of like widely, agreed upon standards. Like the one main thing, and you have it highlighted there, is just the difference in the way that millennials and some of the younger generations look at how they relate to work, right? So when they come to work, they kind of want to be a part of something. So the one main thing is that they work with you and not for you, right? So it's like they're a part of the team. Then, like you just said, they agree with the mission and the value of what they're doing. And you can really get their loyalty and their commitment if you look at them as a part of a team and not just somebody to delegate a task to. So with that, it's a shared responsibility. Like it's, we're working on this together and we're working towards a mutual outcome, not just that is your job, this is my job, you do what you do and I do what I do. I think the collaborative aspect of it really earns the loyalty of millennials. The other thing is work-life balance, and whether that's telecommuting, whether it's flexible schedules, being able to have adjustments in, what days I can come in. Can I come in later? Can I come in earlier? Even things, and I know you guys have it in the office there, like being able to bring your pets to work so people don't have to, bear the expense of having additional things like that, providing childcare and just things like that that allow people to be their whole selves as effectively as possible. And the one thing is this candor, right? Radical candor. Can someone in your company genuinely speak to the CEO about something that they see as wrong without there being retaliation or retribution, right? Just having that, that the ability for people to be honest and share their opinion. Because, like you said, why have diversity in individuals if you don't allow diversity in opinion? So you can have difference in demographics, but an organization will only really grow and thrive if you allow people to share their opinions in a very in a very candid way. And then you have to, and that's going to drive your company culture, right? Your company culture should be openness and integrity, and people can share their opinions and be able to disagree with leadership in a manner that's not going to cost them their job or make them an outcast. And I think the last point is that a lot of people talk about diversity as a program. People talk about diversity as a quota, right? People talk diversity as a requirement of affirmative action and just different things. But from a leadership perspective, if your organization doesn't look diverse from a leadership perspective, it's going to be hard for millennials to believe you, right? So when you say you want a diverse organization, but all of your managers, directors, and executives are, all white males, or they're all males, right? So even if you have diversity from a racial perspective, if you don't have diversity from a gender perspective, or you can have a diverse population of older men, whether they're, Hispanic, Asian, there are no women in diversity. There are no women in leadership. There are no younger people in leadership. I think companies have to represent what they claim to believe in. And if you don't, if there's a disconnect between what you say and then what you actually do, you start to lose millennials, right? We're kind of a see and say, like you say something and then we want to see you do it. So if there's a disconnect, it's going to be hard for you to earn and to maintain our loyalty if you don't kind of live out the things that you claim to espouse as the beliefs and the values of your organization.
Well said, Roy. In summary, I would say that as you go to your managers and they come to you because they're hiring, try your best not to ask the question, what do you want? Because most likely what they want is someone like them, someone they can go have a beer with, someone they'd love to share a meal with, someone who understands their music and their movie references, etc. Instead, try to ask, what do you have? What skill sets do you have right now? What kind of education are your best employees holding or having on their resume? What type of interaction, what type of soft skills exist? If you can measure that, that's even better. So if you can, we have employers that come to us all the time and say, I want people with really high critical thinking. And we say, do you mean problem solving, decision making, or critical thinking? And they just kind of stare at you and go, well, yeah, all that stuff. For us, those are very distinct things rather than one thing. And then if you look at critical thinking and you say, how much do you want? They'll say, oh, as much as I can get, until they see a definition of really high critical thinking. And then they go, oh, God, please not that person. They'd be impossible to work with. And then with two questions, they just look at you and say, I don't even know what I have, so I'm not sure what I need. So if you can help your clients, your hiring managers, understand what they have, then you can search for what they truly need, not just what they want, and then let go of every other thing that they're concerned about, because those are likely tied to their unconscious or even conscious bias. Anything you want to close with, Roy?
Yeah, the one thing I would want to say, especially if this is going to the human resources organization, that as an executive who has to deal directly with human resources, I think too often we put the responsibility on them when it's our fault, right? So I would, because at the end of the day, we're the hiring managers, right? So it's their job to screen employees and candidates and to try to deliver us what we're asking for. But I think a lot of times we ask them for something different, but we don't change our approach to who we're hiring, right? So if we're rewarding the behavior of, you keep giving me the same kind of candidates I've been getting for the last 15 years, and I keep hiring those candidates over the last 15 years, we're not really presenting a need for our human resources partners to do something different, right? So I would say that, that everyone should champion it, and even sometimes human resources should push back and say, well, are you sure you want to hire this guy? I know he's one person available, but you kind of said that, when you hired this person before, you didn't want to pay them this much money, and you're tired of people with this background. Because a lot of times we're just in a rush, right? We're trying to fill a position, we're trying to meet an SLA, and then ultimately we wind up hiring the wrong people that we have to rehire. So just investing and taking that time, like you said, to make sure that people are actually getting what they need and not just what's presenting in front of them isn't the primary responsibility of human resources. And us service executives and hiring managers also need to take the responsibility for only hiring what we want, or really hiring what we need, and not just taking anything that's presented in front of us.
Great, thanks, Roy. And if anybody wants to get in touch with us, you can email us directly, or tweet us, or call our companies and ask for us. Thank you.
Thank you.